Long before she became a symbol of power and triumph, before the medals, the headlines, the applause from stadiums filled with people who once doubted her, Binta Osei was the girl no one noticed. Not the teachers who marked her papers without ever learning her middle name. Not the boys in the schoolyard who pointed and whispered when she passed. Not the neighbors who nodded to her mother, but barely looked at the tall, quiet girl with the slouched shoulders and dusty slippers. She was the kind of child who made herself small, out of habit, not humility, the kind who folded herself into corners during family gatherings, who flinched when addressed too loudly, who wore oversized clothes not out of style, but to hide what she didn't understand about her own body. Her presence didn't fill a room, it barely occupied a seat, and yet, beneath that silence, beneath the lowered eyes and timid nods, something strong was already growing. Not strength in the way the world measured it. Not yet. But a different kind. A quiet refusal to vanish. A stubborn, aching ember that would one day burn through everything they said she couldn't be. She grew up in the dusty town of Goroma, tucked beneath a line of tired hills where goats outnumbered children and silence clung to everything like dust. Her father, a stern mason, and her mother, a soft-spoken woman who worked as a midwife, raised 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Binta was the youngest and the quietest, not because she had nothing to say, but because life taught her early that her voice didn't matter. She walked with her head slightly bent, as though every step carried the weight of something invisible and old. Her eyes rarely met anyone's, not out of rudeness, but out of a learned fear that came from years of being mocked for things she couldn't change. She often traced the lines on the ground with her gaze, as if searching for a crack deep enough to disappear into. Binta didn't laugh loudly like the other girls. In fact, she barely laughed at all. When something was funny, she smiled with her lips pressed together, like joy was something she wasn't quite allowed to own in full. Her voice, when she spoke, was deeper than most girls', a warm, gravelly tone that she'd grown to hate because it drew attention, and not the kind anyone wanted. When she read aloud in class, boys would chuckle. When she answered questions, teachers would blink, surprised by the sound of her. One even asked, jokingly, "Are you sure you're not a boy using a girl's name?" Her limbs were long and awkward, like her body had stretched too fast before her spirit caught up. She moved carefully, afraid of knocking something over, of taking up too much space. Her shoulders were broader than usual, broad enough that people noticed, broad enough that mothers whispered, "That one's built like a boy," and girls giggled behind her back when changing clothes for PE. She hated mirrors, not because she was ugly, though she sometimes believed that too, but because she didn't recognize the girl in them. Her hands were rough from chores, her feet too big for the standard school shoes. Her spine curled forward like she was trying to fold herself into a version the world might accept. People noticed her, but not kindly, not with admiration or welcome. They noticed like they noticed a crack in a wall, something unsightly, strange, something to comment on and move past. And so she made herself quieter, smaller, more obedient. She trained herself to be invisible. But invisibility is a strange kind of prison. It doesn't protect you forever. And they talked. The children at school had names for her. Tree Girl, because of her height. Man Girl, because of her voice. Newt Binter, because she rarely spoke. Every laugh chipped away at her spirit. Every whisper behind her back made her retreat deeper into herself. Her teachers often said, "She's clever, but she doesn't try." No one ever asked why. She learned to disappear, to sit in the back row, to eat alone under the old mango tree, to cry into her pillow with her face turned to the wall. But pain, like seeds, sometimes grows in silence. When she turned 15, her mother died after a long illness. Her father, already distant, became colder. Her older siblings had moved to the city, chasing jobs and leaving her behind. The house felt like an echo chamber, quiet, vast, and lonely. One day during the school holidays, she wandered past the community youth center on her way from the market. Inside, a small, sweaty room with cracked mirrors and old iron weights, a group of young men were lifting and grunting. A radio played somewhere in the corner, fuzzy, muffled music under the clang of metal. She paused. There was something about the way the boys lifted, gritting their teeth, shouting with effort, wiping their brows with pride. It wasn't just strength, it was presence, power. That evening, she returned. This time, she waited until the gym was empty. One of the trainers, an older man named Mr. Doka, was sweeping the floor. "You want something?" he asked, his voice rough. She hesitated, then whispered, "Can I try?" He looked her up and down and sighed. You're too thin. These weights will crush you." She looked at the barbell anyway. He laughed but said nothing as she walked to it. Her arms trembled, but she wrapped her fingers around the cold metal and pulled. It didn't move. She tried again. It rose an inch, then two. She dropped it with a thud. Doka didn't laugh this time. "You've got a strange kind of strength," he muttered. "You want to come back tomorrow?" She nodded. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't cry. What began as a way to pass time became her ritual. Every afternoon after cleaning, she would sneak into the gym. Doka began to coach her. Slowly, methodically, he taught her form, breathing, patience. "You're not here to show off," he'd say. "You're here to transform." In just 6 months, her arms thickened, her back straightened, her posture changed. She no longer looked at the ground when walking. She no longer flinched when someone called her name. But the world wasn't ready. When she wore her training tights in public, people stared. "Are you trying to be a man? Who will marry you with muscles like that?" Bodybuilding is not for African women. Even her father, who rarely spoke to her, said one night, "You better stop before people think you've gone mad." She didn't answer, because Binta had found something that no one could touch: discipline. When the weights got heavier, she got stronger. When the comments got crueler, her silence got sharper. She entered her first competition at 19. It was an amateur local event, filled with boys who laughed when she stepped on stage. But when the scores were announced, the room went quiet. Binta had placed second, a girl from nowhere. A girl who once flinched at her own reflection. The local paper wrote, "A surprise from Garoma, the girl who lifted like a giant." From then on, she trained like a machine. She woke up at 4 a.m., ran with bricks in her backpack, lifted weights in the evening, ate boiled eggs, beans, and bananas. Nothing fancy, just fuel. She read fitness books borrowed from a teacher's shelf. She watched YouTube tutorials on an old phone borrowed from her neighbor. When she turned 22, she entered her first regional men's contest in the city of Dorson. The rules didn't ban women, but none had ever dared enter. The men laughed. One even called her entertainment, but Binta didn't flinch. She deadlifted 150 kilograms, then 170 kilograms, then 190 kilograms, breaking the event's record. Silence. The same men who mocked her lined up to shake her hand. Photos of her standing tall with the gold medal and wide shoulders made the evening news. She didn't smile in the pictures, not because she wasn't proud, but because she still remembered every time someone had called her a joke. Her rise was meteoric. By 25, Binta had won 3 national titles. Sponsors called. A documentary crew followed her for weeks. A clothing brand offered her a deal. But she didn't care much for fame. She still lived in a modest one-room apartment, still swept the gym floor before training, still ate the same food, still walked home carrying her own bag. But the girls of Garoma had changed. They walked taller now. Some had joined her gym. Some lifted water containers in the backyard, dreaming out loud. And the boys? They stopped laughing. One day, during a public event at a school, a young girl asked her, "How did you become so brave?" "I wasn't always brave," Binta said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of every scar it had taken to get here. She paused, eyes scanning the young faces before her, some wide-eyed, some fidgeting, some clearly carrying their own quiet battles. "I know some of you see me now and think I've always been like this, strong, fearless, sure of myself, but that's not the truth. I was bullied," she continued, her voice low but steady. "Every day, not always with fists, but with words, looks, laughter, the kind that makes you question why you were even born the way you are. I was laughed at for how I looked, how I walked, how I sounded. They told me I was too tall, too boyish, too strange. I was ignored too, passed over, spoken around, treated like I was invisible unless I was the punchline. She swallowed hard, memories flickering behind her eyes. There were days I came home and sat on the edge of my bed and just stared at the wall. I didn't cry, because after a while, even the tears stop coming. You just exist, quietly, hoping someone might see something in you worth keeping. She looked down at her calloused hands. But then I found the weights. At first they were just metal, cold, heavy, but when I lifted them, something shifted. For the first time I didn't feel weak. I didn't feel strange. I felt present, like I mattered. I kept lifting, she said, not just the weights, but myself, my shame, my pain, my loneliness, every single day. Even when it hurt, even when I thought I couldn't keep going, I lifted through exhaustion, through mockery, through silence, through nights I didn't eat, through mornings I didn't believe in myself. I lifted because I had to, because no one else was going to lift me. And little by little, I rose. The room was quiet, every girl still, frozen in the weight of what she had just said. No one moved, no one whispered. They were all holding the same breath, and then someone clapped, just once, then another followed, then two more, then five, and suddenly, like a dam breaking, the room erupted into a storm of cheers. They clapped, they stood, they shouted her name, Binta, Binta. They weren't just cheering for her story, they were cheering for themselves, for their pain, for their own quiet strength finally being seen. Binta stood there, hands at her sides, heart thudding. She didn't need to say another word. The moment had already spoken. That night, when she got home, she sat on her bed, opened a faded photo album, and looked at an old picture of a tall, shy girl under a mango tree. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the evening light filtering through the slats of the window, casting soft gold across the worn floor. In her hands lay an old, wrinkled photograph, faded at the edges from years of hiding and surviving. It showed a much younger version of herself, barely 15, standing stiffly under the shade of the old mango tree at the back of her childhood school. Her arms hung awkwardly at her sides, her back curved, her eyes unsure. She looked like she was trying to vanish into the bark behind her. For a long time, Binta just stared at that photo, her thumb running slowly across the glossy surface, tracing the girl she used to be. That girl with trembling hands and hunched shoulders. That girl who flinched when called upon. That girl who cried into her pillow every night and wondered if she would ever belong anywhere. Then she looked up, at the medals hanging on the wall, the certificate framed above her small bookshelf, and the news clipping pinned beside it with the bold headline, "The Woman Who Lifted Through It All." And just like that, something cracked open in her chest. A soft private storm of memory and gratitude. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. She held the photo closer to her heart and, in a voice barely louder than breath, she whispered into the quiet, "We made it, you and me. They never saw you, never heard you, but I did. I carried you through every laugh, every lift, every door they shut in our face. You didn't disappear. You became me. And I didn't forget you. I couldn't. Because everything I am began with everything you survived. We did it." Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more stories.